The morning Ada Nwosu turned 18, she woke to the sound of her mother zipping a suitcase shut in the hallway. It was still dark outside. The kind of June dark that belongs to Boston at 4 in the morning when the street lamps on Beacon Street buzz against the fog, and nothing moves but a single cab crawling up the hill. Ada lay in her narrow bed and listened. She heard the zipper. She heard her mother's slippered feet on the hardwood. She heard the soft click of the front door opening and the heavier thud of something being set down outside. Then the door closed, and her mother's feet moved back toward the kitchen. Ada did not get out of bed for a long time. She lay there with her hands folded over her chest and her eyes open, and she listened to the house she had lived in for 18 years make the small morning sounds it had always made. The radiator in the hall ticking, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the old grandfather clock her father had bought at an estate sale in Newton chiming 5 times. She listened to all of it, and she understood in the way that 18-year-olds sometimes understand things before anyone has told them, that she would never hear any of those sounds again from inside this house. When she finally came downstairs, the suitcase was on the front step. Her mother was not in the kitchen. Her father was not in his study. The house was empty in the way that houses are empty when the people in them have left on purpose without saying where they were going because they did not want to be there when the thing they had set in motion was finished. On top of the suitcase was a single folded sheet of paper. Ada did not pick it up right away. She stood in the open doorway in her bare feet and looked down at it. The sun was just beginning to come up behind the row houses across the street. The light was thin and pink and honest in the way that early morning light is always honest, and it lit up the white paper against the brown canvas of the suitcase like a stone on a grave. She picked it up and read it. Ada, we love you, but we cannot watch you make these choices. When you are ready to be serious about your life, you know where to find us. Inside this envelope is $300. Use it to get wherever you need to go. Mama. That was all. She stood in the doorway holding the letter, and she did not cry. Not yet. Crying was a thing that belonged to a different version of herself. A younger version. The Ada who had been 12 when her grandmother slid the gold ring with the turquoise stone onto her finger. The Ada who had been 14 when that grandmother died. And the Ada who had been 16 when her first poem was printed in a regional literary magazine, and her parents had folded the magazine shut after 3 minutes and asked her about her chemistry grade. That Ada had cried plenty, but the Ada who stood in the doorway on the morning of her 18th birthday had already learned what crying did and did not change. She picked up the suitcase. She reached back inside the front hall and took the canvas tote bag her grandmother had given her, the one with her leather journal and 2 ballpoint pens inside, and she slung it over her shoulder. She closed the door of the Brookline house behind her with her hip because her hands were full. She did not look back. She walked down the front steps and turned left at the sidewalk and began walking toward the T-station at Coolidge Corner. The wheels of the suitcase clicked against the seams in the pavement. The turquoise ring on her right index finger caught the early light. She was 5 blocks from the house before she cried. To understand what she did next, you have to understand who Nneka was. Nneka was Ada's mother's mother, a tall woman with a straight back and gray hair. She wore in a short, natural crop. A woman who had flown from Lagos to Boston every year of Ada's childhood and spent the month of July sleeping on the fold-out couch in the study, She came with 2 hard-sided suitcases full of dried stockfish and palm oil and bitter leaf, and she came with her voice, which was deep and slow, and she came with her hands, which were always doing something. Braiding Ada's hair, kneading dough, turning the pages of a book of poetry by somebody Ada had never heard of, and years later would be unable to find anywhere. Nneka had been the only person in Ada's life who had ever told her that writing was important. Ada's father had come from Enugu on a student visa in 1994 and stayed. He had worked himself through a master's in computer science and into a job at a software company in Cambridge. And by the time Ada was born, he had built the kind of life he had flown across an ocean to build. Her mother had done the same. A nursing degree, a practitioner's license, a steady job at a hospital in Brookline. They had bought the row house with the grandfather clock when Ada was 4. They had paid the mortgage down aggressively. They had voted Democrat, donated to their church, and raised their only child with the quiet conviction that the future of their family in America rested on her shoulders. They were not cruel. Ada would have to remember this later when the anger came. They were not cruel. They were frightened in the particular way that immigrants are frightened, which is the fear of watching the thing you crossed an ocean for slip through the hands of the child you crossed for. But Nneka had been different. Nneka had lived a life her own children did not fully know. She had never explained it to them. She had explained some of it in pieces to Ada on summer afternoons in the Brookline kitchen when Ada was small and her parents were at work. She told Ada that in 1961, when she was 23 years old, she had fallen in love with a man her family had forbidden her to marry. She told Ada that her father had put her on a boat for Liverpool and told her not to come home. She told Ada that she had worked for a year as a housemaid in a cold stone flat in North London, and that she had saved her wages, and that she had crossed to New York on a tourist visa in 1962 and simply never left. She told Ada these things in small pieces, the way you tell a child about a war. She never told her the man's name. And in the summer of Ada's 12th year, sitting on the back porch of the Brookline house, with a glass of Fanta sweating in her hand, Nneka had taken a small gold ring off her own right index finger and slid it onto Ada's. The ring was thin. The gold was old soft 18-carat. In the center of the ring was a single turquoise stone the size of a lentil, set in a tiny bezel of scalloped gold. Rings know things, Nneka had said. Ada had looked at her. The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry, Nneka said. And a ring holds what the hand cannot let go. This ring has been places you and I will never see. One day it will take you somewhere you do not expect. When it does, you will listen. Yes, yes, Grandma. Good girl. Nneka died in a hospital in Lagos 2 years later. Pneumonia. Ada's parents did not fly her home for the funeral. The tickets were too expensive. The school year was too important. Ada had understood. Ada had also, without ever saying it to anyone, decided in a small, still place inside herself that she would never forgive them for it. She kept the ring on her finger every day after that. She touched it when she was nervous. She touched it when she was reading. She touched it when she wrote, which was every morning before school, and every night after her parents had gone to bed. And she touched it now on a bench at the Coolidge Corner tea station, with her suitcase between her knees, and her face hot with crying, and she listened for whatever her grandmother had said, The ring would one day tell her. The ring did not say anything, not yet. But Ada had time. She spent 3 days in a hostel in Chinatown that cost $35 a night. The room was small and clean and smelled faintly of bleach. There were 4 bunks, and she took the top one by the window, and she lived on peanut butter sandwiches and tap water and cups of bad coffee from a deli on the corner. On the first day, she called the writing program that had accepted her. The woman on the phone was kind. Her name was Karen, and she had the voice of a person who had given bad news to a lot of 18-year-olds and had never found a way to make it stop mattering. Without a parental signature on the FAFSA, Karen said the aid would not come through. Not enough of it. Not for a program like theirs. There were other programs, Karen said. Community college, state school, a gap year, a chance to come back when she was 24 and legally independent. Ada thanked her. She hung up the phone. She sat on the top bunk with her knees pulled up to her chest, and she did not move for 2 hours. On the second day, she began to think. She was 18. She had $180 left. She had a laptop, a journal, a turquoise ring, and a canvas tote bag. She had no family she could call, no school she could attend, and no plan. She opened the laptop and she began to search. She searched for cheap places to live, and she did not restrict the search to Boston. She did not restrict it to the United States at first, though she would come back to that. She searched for small towns with housing programs. She searched for artist residencies. She searched for the places people went when they had run out of places to go. And late on the third night, with her neck aching and her eyes burning and the hostel common room almost empty, she found the listing. It was on a county website in Washington County, Maine. Down East Maine, the page called it, with the Atlantic on one side and the Canadian border close enough to reach in under an hour by car. The page was old. The fonts were the fonts of a website that had not been redesigned since 2009. Ada scrolled down past a paragraph about lobster licenses and a notice about tick season, and she found near the bottom of the page a small section headed Heritage Properties Program. Under it was a list, 3 properties, each of them priced at $1. She clicked the second one. The listing was for a stone cottage near the village of Ashport Harbor. The cottage had been abandoned since 1973, and before that had been the primary residence of a local woman who had left the property to the town in her will. The listing described the building as a one-room stone structure of approximately 375 square feet with original slate roof, partially collapsed chimney. No vehicle access, no utilities, and a half-acre of land bordering the ocean, on a stretch of granite coastline known locally as Thomas Point. There were conditions. The buyer had to commit to living on the property or restoring it within 5 years. The buyer had to register as a resident of Washington County. The buyer had to acknowledge and preserve the cultural and historical significance of the building. The listing noted in the same flat municipal language that the property had been held by the town for more than 50 years, and that the Heritage Properties Program had been unable to place it, despite repeated efforts. $1. Ada stared at the screen for a long time. The cursor blinked. Outside the hostel window, a garbage truck made its slow pull up the street, and a man in a reflective vest shouted something to the driver. And Boston kept moving the way Boston always moves. She touched the turquoise ring on her right index finger. She thought about what her grandmother had said. She thought about the suitcase on the front step. She thought about Karen on the phone with her careful, practiced voice. She thought about the thin wad of bills in her wallet and the hours she had left before she would need to decide something. She thought with a clarity that felt almost dangerous that a stone cottage on the coast of Maine was not more absurd than a night in a hostel in Chinatown, and that both of those things were less absurd than continuing to sit in this bunk until her money ran out. She opened a new tab. She looked up Greyhound schedules to Bangor. The overnight bus left South Station at 8 in the evening and arrived in Bangor at 6 in the morning. From Bangor, there was a connecting bus that ran 3 times a week to Machias, and from Machias, a local shuttle that stopped if you asked the driver anywhere along Route 1 between Machias and Eastport. The whole trip end to end was $62. She bought the ticket. The bus ride was 14 hours. Ada slept in pieces. She woke near Portland to a man across the aisle coughing. She woke again at a rest stop near Augusta with her face pressed against the cold glass and her neck at a bad angle. She wrote in her journal for a while by the yellow overhead light while the bus pulled through black miles of pine forest. She wrote about her grandmother. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about a turquoise stone and a hearth and a suitcase on a front step. And somewhere between Ellsworth and Machias, she fell asleep with the pen still in her hand and did not wake again until the driver called her stop. Ashport Harbor at 11 in the morning smelled like salt and wood smoke in the inside of an old wooden building. It was not a town so much as an idea of one. A 2-lane road curving along the edge of a cove, a white-steepled congregational church, a general store with a sign that said gas bait coffee in hand-painted block letters, a post office the size of a shed, 3 pickup trucks parked in front of a diner called Marge's, a harbor full of working lobster boats riding the swell at their moorings, and beyond them, the open Atlantic, gray and wide and alive. The clerk she needed to find was in a small clapboard building next to the church. A sign on the door said, Washington County Heritage Properties, and under it, in smaller letters, a list of hours that amounted to 4 half-days a week. Ada pushed the door open. A bell rang. The woman behind the desk looked up. She was about 65, silver hair cut short, half-moon reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She was wearing a fisherman's sweater and a pair of dark slacks, and she had the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors in weather. A small brass nameplate on her desk said, Maura Fitzgerald. She looked at Ada. She looked at the suitcase. She looked, without quite meaning to, at the turquoise ring on Ada's right index finger. Her eyes stayed on the ring for a long moment. Can I help you? Maura said. Ada handed her the printed listing. Maura put on her reading glasses. She read the listing slowly, though Ada suspected she could have recited it from memory. She took the glasses off and set them down on the desk, and she looked at Ada again. Her face did not change exactly, but something behind it did. You came alone, Maura said. Yes. From where? Boston. Maura nodded. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said very quietly, How old are you, honey? 18. Maura closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she did not look surprised. She looked like a woman who had been expecting something for a long time and had finally seen it come through her door. Sit down, she said. Ada sat. Mora reached into the drawer of her desk and took out a form. She set it on the blotter in front of her. She folded her hands on top of it. "I have worked in this office for 31 years, Mora said. In those 31 years, I have tried to place the Sullivan cottage 7 times. Do you understand what I'm telling you? 7 times a person has come through that door and asked about it. A couple from Stuttgart in 1998. An architect from Boston in 2003. A developer in 2007 who wanted to turn it into a rental. A retired nurse from Portland in 2011. 2 different writers. A man from Nova Scotia who said his grandmother had been born there. Every single one of them walked out to the property to have a look. Every single one of them came back within 3 hours and told me in one way or another that they had changed their minds." She paused. "They don't all say why. Some of them do. The ones who say why usually say something about the cold, or about the wind, or about the way the cottage makes them feel when they stand inside it. One woman told me she could not breathe properly until she got back down the hill. I will tell you something honestly. I do not know why they leave, but I will tell you what I do know." Ada waited. "That cottage belonged to a man named Callum Sullivan," Mora said. "Callum was a private first class in the United States Army. He was from this parish. He left here in 1939 with his wife Maeve, and he enlisted the year after Pearl Harbor, and he was killed in action outside a town called Aachen in Germany in March of 1945. He was 36 years old." Mora's voice did not shake, but it slowed. "Maeve came back to that cottage after the war. She lived in it alone for almost 30 years. She left it to the town when she moved to New York in 1973, with the condition that if the town could not maintain the building itself, it should be offered to someone who would. That is what the Heritage Program is. That cottage is the only property we have ever had in this program that came with that kind of condition in the will. The American Legion Post has tried to keep it up over the years. The Historical Society has tried. For more than 50 years, this town has been trying to find someone who could live in that building, and it has not happened." She looked at Ada. She looked at the ring again. "It is a hard place, honey. The roof is half gone. There is no power. There is no road. The well is probably still good, but you would have to test it. The nearest working phone is at the general store, and the nearest hospital is 40 miles away. The winter up here is not the winter you are used to. I have seen grown men from away try to spend one February in Washington County and leave in tears in March. You understand what I am saying to you?" "I understand. Do you have anyone you can call?" "No, ma'am." Mora was quiet for a long time. Then she reached into her own wallet and took out a dollar bill and put it in the little metal cash box on the corner of her desk, and she began to fill out the form. "I will tell you something else," she said, without looking up. "I do not know why those other people walked out of that cottage, but I also do not know why you walked in here wearing that ring." Ada looked at her. Mora finished filling out the form. She turned it around and handed Ada a pen. "Sign here, please, Ada Nwosu." Ada signed. "Welcome to Washington County," Mora said. The walk from the parish office to the cottage was a little more than 3 miles. Mora had drawn her a map on the back of a receipt. Down Harbor Road to the fork, left at the fork onto the old coast road, past the Whelan farm, which Ada would know by the red gambrel barn and the border collies, over the footbridge at Crow Creek, then off the road and up the footpath through the spruce, and after about half a mile she would see the cottage on the rise above the granite headland. Ada walked. The suitcase was a problem. The wheels caught in the gravel at the edge of the road. She dragged it anyway, switching hands when her arm got tired, the canvas tote with her journal, bumping softly against her hip. The sun was high. The air off the ocean was cold even in June. She passed a field of juniper and low-bush blueberry and a gray weathered barn with the doors standing open, and a black-and-white collie who watched her from the top of a stone wall and did not bark. She crossed the footbridge at Crow Creek. The water underneath was brown and clear and smelled like peat. She left the road and started up the footpath through the spruce, and the spruce closed in around her, and the road disappeared behind her. And for 20 minutes she walked in the kind of silence that is not silence at all, but wind and needles and the distant cry of a gull. The path rose. The trees thinned. She came out onto open ground. The cottage was there. She stopped walking and she just looked. It was smaller than she had imagined, about 25 feet long and 15 feet wide. A single rectangular building of rough gray fieldstone, mortared with lime that had gone soft at the seams and crumbled out in places to show the dark gaps between the stones. The roof was slate. Thick, heavy American slate the color of a thundercloud patched with moss, and in one place near the middle a section had caved in, and you could see down through the rafters to the shadowed inside. A single tall stone chimney rose from the center of the roof. Half of its top course had fallen away, and the old clay flue was open to the sky. 2 small square windows flanked a heavy oak door. The door had rusted iron hinges and it hung slightly ajar. It had been hanging that way, Ada understood, for a long time. Around the cottage, the remains of a garden. Wild roses grown into thick, thorny mounds along the south wall. Foxglove in spikes of purple and cream. A leaning gatepost with no gate left on it, marking the beginning of a path that had mostly gone back to grass. Beyond the cottage, the land fell away to the ocean. Ada walked closer. The wind came in hard off the Atlantic and caught her hair. She set the suitcase down in the grass beside the path. She put her hand on the oak door, and she pushed. The hinges cried, but they held. She stepped inside. The inside of the cottage was a single room, and it was the kind of room that makes you understand all at once what people mean when they use the word sacred. The floor was flagstone. Great gray pieces of cut stone laid flat, covered in a fine gray dust, and scattered bits of fallen slate from the roof. The walls were the inside face of the same fieldstones as the outside, uneven and rough and beautiful in the irregular way that nothing machine-made is ever beautiful. The ceiling was open to the rafters. The beams were dark, pine probably or spruce, hand-hewn and joined with wooden pegs. At the north end of the room was the hearth. Ada had seen fireplaces before. She had lived in a house with a fireplace for her entire life. What she was looking at was not a fireplace. What she was looking at was an altar. The hearth took up almost the entire north wall. A great stone firebox deep enough to walk into with an iron crane still hanging from a hook in the back wall, for lifting cooking pots on and off the fire. The stones of the hearth were blackened. A century of cooking fires. More than a century. The surface of the stone was glazed with soot and carbon, and the residue of everything that had ever been burned there. Above the firebox, a rough wooden mantel, empty now. A shelf above that also empty. The kind of mantel where a family would have kept its photographs and its candlesticks, and once maybe a rosary. And in front of the firebox, laid flat into the flagstone floor, a single massive hearthstone. It was larger than the other flagstones, about 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep, cut from a slab of gray granite, thick enough that when Ada knelt in front of it and put her palm flat against its surface, she could feel the cold of the earth coming up through it. She stayed like that for a while, kneeling, breathing, her hand on the stone. The cottage was quiet around her. The wind outside had dropped. Somewhere far off, a raven called and called again, and then was quiet. Ada closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about what Maura Fitzgerald had said about 7 people walking out of this cottage in 50 years. She thought about her own hand on her own knee, and her own breath going in and out, and the fact that whatever fear those other people had felt when they stood where she was standing, she was not feeling it. She felt, if anything, the opposite. She felt held. She felt the way she had felt when she was small, and her grandmother had braided her hair in the kitchen and told her that the world was larger than her parents' idea of it. She opened her eyes. She lifted her hand off the hearthstone, and as she did, something caught her eye. A line along the edge of the stone. Not a crack. A gap. Ada leaned closer. She brushed the gray dust away with the side of her hand. The hearthstone met the surrounding flagstones along all 4 of its edges, and in 3 of those edges the joint was tight, mortared, flush. But on the 4th edge, the edge closest to the firebox, the joint was not tight. There was a narrow gap between the hearthstone and the flagstone next to it. Not wide, maybe 1/4 of an inch, but clean, deliberate, cut smooth as if the hearthstone had been made to lift. She pressed down on one corner of the stone with her palm. Nothing happened. She pressed down on the corner diagonally opposite. The stone rocked, almost imperceptibly, but it rocked. Ada sat back on her heels. Her heart had started to move in a way she had not felt it move since the morning she had found the suitcase on the step. She stood up. She walked to the door. She looked out at the yard, and at the wind-bent grass, and at the line of the Atlantic on the horizon, and then she walked around the cottage to where the old stone wall ran along the north edge of the garden. Tucked against the wall, half grown over with bindweed, was a rusted length of iron bar. It might have been a piece of a fence post once. It might have been a piece of a hay rake. She pulled it out of the weeds. She carried it back inside. She knelt in front of the hearthstone again. She wedged the tip of the iron bar into the gap along the edge. She pressed her weight down. On the other end, the hearthstone lifted. It lifted slowly and heavily the way things move when they have been still for a very long time. Ada felt the muscles in her arms and her shoulders and her back take the weight. 200 pounds, maybe more. The bar bent slightly. The stone came up in her hands until it was balanced on its own edge. Under it, black and cold and patient, was a cavity. She knelt there a long time with the iron bar still in her hand and the cold air from the cavity rising into her face. The hole was not large. It was maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet long and about as deep as her forearm. It was lined, she could see now, with flat pieces of the same fieldstone the walls were made of, fitted together without mortar. A careful, small chamber built into the foundation of the cottage, the way a man builds a thing he means to last. Inside the chamber was a bundle. Ada did not reach for it right away. She set the iron bar down on the flagstones beside her quietly, the way you set down a tool in a room where somebody is sleeping. She wiped her hands on the knees of her jeans. She looked at the bundle. It was wrapped in oilcloth. The oilcloth was dark, nearly black, stiff with age, and the weight of whatever it had been coated in 80 years ago to keep the weather out. It was tied with heavy twine crossed twice around the middle and knotted on top. The knot had a kind of neatness to it. A woman's hands, Ada thought. A woman who had been taught to tie a knot properly and had never forgotten. She reached in. The bundle was heavier than it looked. She lifted it out slowly, both hands under it, and she carried it to the wooden mantel above the firebox and set it down there because the floor felt wrong. This was not a thing to be opened on the floor. She did not know why she felt that. She felt it anyway. She untied the twine. The knot resisted for a second and then gave. She folded back the oilcloth. Inside were 4 things. A small tin box, painted dark green with a hinged lid and a brass clasp. A leather-bound ledger. The leather cracked and split along the spine, but still whole. A wooden rosary dark bead strung on a cord that had gone brittle with a small brass crucifix, and a cloth pouch drawn shut at the mouth with a bit of yarn heavy for its size, in a way that told Ada before she had even opened it that there was money inside. She opened the tin box first. The inside of the tin had a small square of waxed paper laid over the contents. She lifted the paper away. Jewelry, old jewelry, the kind with the weight and the workmanship of things made by hand, in a time when things were made by hand because there was no other way to make them. A pair of earrings set with small dark garnets. A thin gold chain with a small cross pendant. The cross no bigger than her thumbnail. A gold ring set with a single pale blue stone. Maybe a sapphire, maybe an aquamarine, Ada could not tell. A locket on a gold chain. She lifted the locket into the light. It was oval, about the size of a quarter, its gold worn soft and warm at the edges from years of being held. She worked the clasp with her thumbnail. The locket opened. Inside was a photograph, a man and a woman. The photograph was small, the size of a fingernail, black and white, and silvered with age. The man had a dark, square face and a serious mouth. His hair combed back from his forehead. The woman had light hair pinned up on her head and a direct gaze that held the camera without smiling. She was wearing a pale dress with a simple collar. She was young. Not much older than Ada was now, maybe, though the photograph made her hard to read. Ada looked at the 2 faces for a long time. She did not yet know their names. But she already knew, in the way you know things before you have the words for them, that she was looking at the people who had built this cottage and lived in it, and left what was in front of her on the mantel for whoever came next. She set the locket down. She opened the ledger. The paper was thick and yellowed, and the ink had faded from black to a soft walnut brown. But the handwriting was perfectly legible. A careful, schooled, slightly forward-leaning hand. A woman who had been taught by nuns, Ada guessed. A woman who had written letters for her whole life. The first entry was dated the 14th of October, 1939. It began by naming the writer, Maeve Sullivan. It named her husband, Callum Sullivan. It said that they were leaving the cottage the next morning. It said that Callum had decided to go to England and volunteer, even though America was not in the war yet. And he did not have to go because he had family in Liverpool. And he had watched what was happening across the water, and he could not stand still. It said that Maeve was going with him. It said that she would find work as a nurse's aide in whatever hospital would have her, and that she would wait for him. It said that they were hiding everything they owned of value under the hearthstone, the way Callum's grandmother had hidden things during troubles long before. It said that if they came back, they would reclaim what was there. It said that if they did not come back, it was to be left for whoever needed it. Ada read the entry twice. Then she turned the page. The entries were not frequent. Maeve had not kept the ledger the way a person keeps a diary. She had kept it the way a person keeps a family Bible, opening it only for things that had to be written down, because they were too large to carry any other way. There was an entry from the spring of 1942. Maeve had come back to the cottage on a ship from Liverpool, crossing in convoy 3 weeks at sea. She had spent 1 week at the cottage. She had added money to the cavity under the hearthstone. She had written that Callum had joined the United States Army after Pearl Harbor, having crossed back from England in 1941 and enlisted in Portland, and that he was in North Africa. She had written that she prayed. The entry was 6 sentences long. Ada read it 3 times before she turned the page, because something about the shortness of it felt like a woman riding against a great pressure, keeping her hand steady, because the alternative was to stop moving. There was an entry from 1944. Callum had been transferred to a unit that was moving up through Italy. Maeve did not know where he was. The mail was slow. She had not heard from him in 9 weeks. She had come back to the cottage for a month to rest. Her hands were shaking when she wrote. Ada could see it in the letters, in the small tremor that the pen had left on the page. There was an entry from May of 1945. Ada read it and set the ledger down and walked to the open doorway and stood there for a while, looking out at the ocean. Callum had been killed in Germany. March the 21st, 1945. A place Maeve called Aachen. She had received the telegram in Liverpool on the 8th of April. She had come home to Maine 3 weeks later. She had written the entry in this cottage at the kitchen table that no longer existed on a night in May. When she wrote, there was no moon. She had written only 1 line under the date. He will not be coming home. Ada stood in the doorway and let the wind come in off the Atlantic and press against her face. The ocean was gray and wide, and it did not care about Callum Sullivan. It had not cared about him in 1945 either. It had kept moving then the way it was moving now. And Maeve had come home on a boat across it, and Maeve had written 1 line in a ledger and closed the book. After a long time, Ada went back to the mantel and opened the ledger again. There were more entries. Maeve had lived in the cottage for another 28 years. The entries grew further and further apart. A note about the roof being patched in 1948. A note about a neighbor who had died. A note in 1962 about a niece in Portland who had written her a letter and asked her to come live with the family. And about Maeve declining because she wrote, "This is my place." And then, Near the end of the ledger, the final entry. It was dated the 3rd of June, 1973. Maeve had written that she was leaving the cottage for the last time. She was 63 years old. Her cousin in Queens had offered her a bedroom in his apartment. The farm did not pay. The winters were too hard on her hands. She was leaving everything under the hearthstone exactly as she and Callum had left it in 1939, plus what she had added over the years. She did not have the heart, she wrote, to take it out now. The jewelry had belonged to Callum's mother and grandmother. The money was their savings from before the war, plus her hospital wages from the war years, plus what had come to her as a military widow. She wrote that she was leaving it for whoever found the cottage next. She wrote that whoever it was would be a stranger to her, but that the cottage would know them. She wrote one more line after that in a slightly different ink, as if she had come back to the page after a few minutes to add it. If the cottage has let you in, she wrote, that is all the permission you will ever need from me. Maeve Sullivan. June 3rd, 1973. Ada closed the ledger. She stood at the mantel for a long time with her hand flat on the leather cover. Outside, the sun had moved across the sky. The light through the two small windows had gone from the hard white of noon to the softer gold of late afternoon. A crow called somewhere over the spruce. The cottage kept its silence. After a while, she opened the cloth pouch. Inside were bills. American money, paper money, mostly from the 1940s. Some of it later up through the 60s, folded carefully into bundles tied with yarn. Ada did not count it all. She counted enough to know that what was in her hands as paper currency was probably not worth more than a few $100s at face value. But that, as collectible notes sold to the right dealer in Boston or New York, would be worth many times that. And at the bottom of the pouch, wrapped in a separate scrap of waxed paper, were 6 United States war bonds. She lifted them out. They were Series E war bonds, 1943, issued to Callum Sullivan, care of Maeve Sullivan, Ashport Harbor, Maine. $25 each at purchase, unredeemed. Ada did not know yet what they were worth. But she knew, looking at the dates and the signatures and the embossed eagle on the paper, that they were worth something. That they had been bought by a young married couple before a war that would take one of them, and that the widow who survived had chosen, for reasons Ada would spend a long time trying to understand, not to cash them in. She set the bonds on the mantel. She wrapped everything back into the oilcloth, not the ledger. The ledger she kept out on the mantel. Everything else she wrapped carefully and tied again with the same twine. And she set the bundle down on the hearthstone, and she stepped outside into the late afternoon light. She stood at the edge of the granite headland and looked out at the Atlantic. Her hand was on the turquoise ring. "You were right, Grandma," she said. She said it out loud. There was no one to hear her but the ocean. That night, Ada slept in the cottage. She did not sleep on the floor. Maura Fitzgerald had given her the phone number of a widow named Eileen Murphy who lived a mile down the road, and who Maura had said would put her up for as long as she needed. Ada had the number folded into her wallet. She would call it in the morning. But the first night she stayed in the cottage. She rolled out her coat as a pillow on the flagstones in front of the hearth. She pulled the tote bag over her chest like a blanket. She kept the ledger within reach of her hand. She did not build a fire. She did not know yet how to build a fire in a hearth that size, and she did not trust the chimney. She lay on the stone floor. and she listened to the cottage breathe around her, and she slept better in the cold and on the stone than she had slept in 3 years in a bed in Brookline. In the morning, she walked back to the village. She called Eileen Murphy from the payphone outside the general store. Eileen told her to come on over. Ada walked. The road wound along the coast through a belt of spruce and then opened onto pasture, and at the top of a low rise, she came to a small white farmhouse with a lilac bush by the front door and a sign in the yard that said, "Eggs." Eileen Murphy was 85 years old. She was barely 5 feet tall. She had a back that was beginning to curve and hands that had held a rake and a needle and a newborn and a husband's coffin across the length of a long life. And she looked at Ada standing on her porch and said, "Come in, child. I have tea." Ada stayed with Eileen for 6 weeks. Eileen did not ask many questions. Eileen had lived long enough to know that when a person turns up on your porch, it is usually because they have run out of places to turn up, and that the best thing you can do for them is give them a bed and a warm meal, and the time to decide what to say next. Ada decided over the course of those 6 weeks to say most of it. She told Eileen about her parents. She told her about the writing program. She told her about NECA. She told her in careful pieces about the bundle under the hearthstone, and about the ledger, and about Maeve. Eileen listened. Eileen made tea. Eileen on the 3rd evening said a thing Ada would remember for the rest of her life. "The hearth holds what the heart cannot carry," Eileen said without looking up from her knitting. That was an old saying in these parts once. My mother used to say it. I had not thought of it in 50 years. Ada looked at her. "It means," Eileen said, "that we all have things we cannot carry through the whole of a life. Too heavy. So we put them somewhere. A hearth is a good place. A hearth is where people sit and tell each other the truth. A hearth is where the fire burns long enough to make a thing warm again." She looked up. "Your grandmother," she said. "The one in Africa." She said the same thing she did. Eileen nodded once and went back to her knitting. "I thought so," she said. In the 2nd week, Ada found a lawyer. Her name was Neve Callahan, and she practiced out of a small storefront in Machias. Ada took the bus down. She brought the ledger. She brought the bundle. She laid everything out on Neve Callahan's desk. And Neve Callahan, who was in her 50s and had been a rural property lawyer for 30 years, put on her glasses and went through every piece of it, and then took her glasses off and set them down. "Under the laws of the state of Maine," Neve said, "and under the specific terms of the Heritage Properties Program, what was found on the property belongs to you. There is no contrary claim. I checked before you came in. Maeve Sullivan died in Queens, New York in 1988. She left no children. She left no will beyond what she signed over to the town for the cottage itself. You are the legal owner of the property and therefore of what was inside it." Ada sat very still. "Do you want my advice?" Neve said. "Yes. Sell the jewelry you do not want to keep. Sell the currency to a numismatist. I know one in Portland who is honest. Cash in the war bonds at the post office in Bangor. Do not sell the ledger. Do not sell the rosary. Those are not money. Those are family. You are the family now." Ada nodded. "And child," Neve said, "you should find someone local to help you with the building. The cottage is sound. I know stone." That cottage is as sound as anything built before the war, but it needs a man who knows how to relay slate and set a chimney. And there is one man in this county I would call before any other. His name is Declan O'Brien. He is 72 years old. His father worked on that cottage once when Maeve was still living in it. If he will take the job, take him. Ada took her card. Declan O'Brien had eyes the color of wet slate and hands that did not quite close all the way anymore. He was sitting on an overturned bucket in the side yard of his farmhouse when Ada came up the drive. He was drinking coffee out of a tin cup. He watched her come. A border collie at his feet watched her too, and did not bark. When she reached him, he did not stand. He just looked at her. "You are the one who took the Sullivan place," he said. "Yes, sir. They call me Declan." "Yes, Declan." He looked at her for another long moment. "How old are you?" 18. He nodded slowly. He set the tin cup down on the bucket next to his knee. "My father relaid that slate roof in 1949, he said, 4 years after Callum was killed. Maeve paid him in eggs and in cash. He told me when I was a boy that Maeve Sullivan was the strongest woman he had ever met. He told me that 100 times. I will go look at the cottage with you tomorrow, if you will walk me up there. I am slower than I was, but my eyes still work." "Thank you," Ada said. Declan picked up his tin cup. "Bring the ledger," he said. Ada walked Declan up the coast road the next morning slowly, because his right hip had been replaced twice, and he did not move fast on rough ground anymore. When they reached the cottage, he stopped at the edge of the yard and looked at the building for a long time without speaking. Then he went inside. He walked around the room. He ran his hand over the stones of the wall. He tapped the rafters with a pencil he took from his pocket. He stood in the firebox of the hearth and looked up the flue, and he came out with soot on his shoulder. He stood in front of the mantel and he looked at the ledger which Ada had brought and sat there open to the first entry. He read the first page. He read it a second time. Then he turned his face away from her, and for a few seconds Ada saw that his eyes had gone wet. He did not wipe them. He did not say anything. He just breathed. "My father was in the 30th Infantry," he said at last. Ada waited. "So was Callum Sullivan," the old Hickory Declan said. That was the name of the division. 30th Infantry. They fought their way up from Normandy through France and into Belgium and into Germany. My father was with them the whole way. Callum Sullivan was with them from the spring of 1943. They had been together for 2 years by the time they got to Aachen. He turned back to Ada. "I grew up hearing Callum Sullivan's name at our kitchen table," he said. "My father said it more than he said the names of his own brothers. Do you know why?" Ada shook her head. "Because Callum Sullivan pulled my father and 10 other men out of a collapsed cellar in Aachen in March of 1945. There was a bombardment. A building came down on top of a squad that had taken cover in it. Callum went in alone. He lifted timbers off men and dug them out with his hands and carried the ones who could not walk. He brought out 11 men. 11. And on the 12th trip on his way back in to look for a last one, a shell came in." Declan stopped. "My father was one of the 11. Ada could not speak. "My father wrote to his captain after the war," Declan said. asked what had come of the paperwork. Callum was put in for a silver star. The paperwork never made it through. There was a fire at a records depot in St. Louis in 1973, but the paperwork had already been lost before that. The citation was never processed. My father went to his grave in 1988, not knowing why. He asked me the week before he died to keep trying. I did for a while. I let it go. It is hard to fight the United States government from a farm in Washington County. That afternoon, Declan and Ada sat at Eileen Murphy's kitchen table with a pot of tea between them and a yellow legal pad in front of them, and they made a list. The roof first. The slate that had fallen had to be replaced. Declan knew a salvage yard in Millinocket that sold reclaimed American slate by the pallet. The chimney needed a new top course. They could lay it in June when the weather broke properly. The windows had to be reglazed. The door had to be rehung. The flagstones inside were sound. The walls were sound. The well would be tested. Ada could do the interior work herself, Declan said, if she was willing to learn. She was willing. By the end of July, the jewelry had been sold. The locket Ada kept. The blue stone ring Ada kept. The garnet earrings and the gold chain with the cross she sold through the dealer in Portland for $11,200. The currency she sold to the numismatist for $4,800. The war bonds, when she cashed them in at the post office in Bangor, had matured to their full maximum value decades earlier. They came to $1,400, $17,400 all told. It was not a fortune. It was enough to put on a roof. By September, the new slate was on. Declan and his grandson, Michael, laid it over 6 weeks, working from dawn until the afternoon light went flat. Ada worked on the ground. She hauled the old broken slate down the hill in a wheelbarrow. She mixed the lime mortar by hand in a galvanized tub, folding the lime and the sand and the water the way Declan had shown her, slow, patient watching for the right texture. She carried buckets of the mortar up a ladder to where Declan and Michael were working on the chimney. Her hands blistered. Her hands calloused. Her hands changed. In October, she reglazed the windows herself. Declan stood below her on the ladder and watched her work, correcting her grip on the glazier's knife, telling her when she was pressing too hard and when she was not pressing hard enough. In November, she laid a new hearthstone seal along the edge of the firebox, where the old mortar had failed, and she did it without help. She wrote in the mornings. She wrote sitting on an upended crate by the window, her journal on her knees, her breath making small clouds in the cold air of the still unheated cottage. She wrote about Maeve. She wrote about Callum. She wrote about her grandmother. She wrote carefully and without anger about her mother and her father. She filled one notebook and then another, and in early November, without telling anyone, she sent a small packet of 3 poems to a literary quarterly in Portland. They accepted all 3. It was the first time her work had been published under her real name in a place her parents would never think to look. She did not tell them. She did not call them. She did not write to them. She thought about them sometimes in the evenings when the cottage was quiet and the stove was finally in, and she had nothing to do but watch the fire. She thought about them the way you think about a country you were born in but no longer live in, with a certain old tenderness, with no wish to return. It was late November when she found the torn page. She had been rereading the ledger. She had read it by that point perhaps a dozen times. She had begun to notice things about it that she had not noticed at first. Small notations in the margins. Dates crossed out and rewritten. Places where Maeve had clearly stopped mid-sentence and come back days or weeks later and finished the thought. And in the middle of the ledger between the entry for the spring of 1945 and the entry for the autumn of 1946, a page had been torn out. She had not noticed it the first time she read the ledger, or the second. She had not been looking for it. Now, holding the book up to the window, she saw the stub of the missing page clearly. It had been torn cleanly along the binding, almost all the way. Almost. At the very base of the spine, a small triangle of paper still clung to the stitching, no larger than her thumbnail. Ada held the ledger close to her eye, and she read what was written on that triangle. 2 lines, half lines, fragments. June 19th, 1946. The child of Callum he will never know. That was all. Ada sat down on the flagstones in front of the hearth. She sat there for a long time with the ledger open on her knee and the firelight moving on the stones. And she understood slowly the size of what she had just found. Maeve Sullivan had come back from the war, pregnant. Maeve Sullivan had given birth to Callum Sullivan's child in June of 1946, 15 months after Callum was killed in Germany. And Maeve Sullivan had done something with that child that she could not bring herself to name even in her own private ledger, except in the one line she had written and then torn out and then failed quite to tear out all the way. Ada thought about the ledger entries after 1946. She had read them many times. They did not mention a child. They did not mention any child. Maeve Sullivan had lived in this cottage alone for 27 more years, and she had never written another word about her son. Ada closed the ledger. She did not tell Declan. She did not tell Eileen. She folded the torn page secret into herself the way Maeve must have folded it into herself. And she carried it for a long time because she did not know what to do with it. And because there was no one it seemed to her that she had the right to tell. January came down like a hammer. It came on a Tuesday. The weather report at the general store had said a storm was coming, and Ada had bought extra candles and extra kerosene and extra peanut butter and walked back up the hill with the bag over her shoulder and the first flakes already falling. By dark, the wind was up. By midnight, the cottage was shaking in gusts that came off the Atlantic at 60-70 miles an hour. The windows held. The roof held. Ada sat by the stove and listened to the house her hands had helped rebuild, fight a sky that wanted it down. The storm did not stop. It snowed for 7 days. By the 3rd day, the drifts against the south wall of the cottage were 4 feet deep. By the 5th day, the footpath down to the road was gone. Not under snow, but under a sculpted mountain of wind-carved white that had filled the ravine where the path ran. By the 6th day, Ada had burned through most of her firewood. By the 7th, she was rationing. 1 small log every 2 hours. She slept in her coat. She ate cold peanut butter out of the jar because she did not want to open the stove door long enough to heat water. On the night of the 7th day, the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. Ada sat up in her blankets and she was afraid. Not afraid of a thing she could name. Afraid of the cold itself, which had begun to seem for the first time in her life. Not like weather, but like an intention. a thing that was trying to come inside. She kept the fire as high as she dared with the wood she had left. She put on every piece of clothing she owned. She wrapped the ledger and the locket and the blue stone ring and her journal together in the oilcloth from the bundle, and she held them against her chest. She thought for the first time since the morning of her birthday that her parents might have been right. She wrote one line in her journal by the light of a single candle. "I do not know if I am strong enough for this." She closed the journal. She fell asleep sitting up against the hearth. At some point in the night, she became aware of a sound. It was not the wind. The wind had been the only sound for a week, and she had stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a river you live next to. This was a different sound, a knocking, slow, steady, deliberate. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. She opened her eyes. The candle had burned down to its base. The fire was almost out. The cottage was very cold. The knocking came again. Ada got up. She went to the door. Her hands were stiff. She worked the latch. She pulled. The door opened and a wall of snow came in with it. And behind the snow was a man. He was enormous in his parka, and his boots, and the oilskin wrap he had pulled over his face against the wind. He was carrying a canvas tarp over his shoulder, and the tarp was loaded with split firewood, and he was breathing hard, and the frost was white on his beard. He pulled the wrap down from his face. "Miss Inwosu," he said. His voice was rough and slow. "I'm Finnegan Whelan from down the road. I thought maybe you'd be needing some wood." Ada stared at him. Then she started to cry. Finn Whelan stepped into the cottage and dropped the tarp of firewood on the flagstones and closed the door behind him against the screaming sky, and he knelt in front of the stove without a word and began with the calm, methodical movements of a man who had done this for other people's houses and his own many times to bring her fire back. Finn Whelan stayed until morning. He did not speak much. He was not a man built for speaking. He was built for the thing he was doing, which was kneeling in front of a cold stove in a stone cottage on a headland in the middle of the worst storm Washington County had seen in 30 years, feeding small pieces of split birch to a bed of coals until the coals remembered what they were for. He worked without hurrying. He fed the fire the way a man feeds a newborn foal patient. Unsurprised, certain that a thing kept warm long enough will live. When the stove was hot again, he stood up, and he looked at Ada, who was sitting on the floor with the oilcloth bundle still pressed against her chest and the tears frozen on her face. And he said, "You'll be all right now, miss." And he sat down on the stone bench by the door, and he did not leave. He stayed all night. He did not make conversation. He did not ask her questions. He pulled a small thermos out of his coat and poured her a cup of coffee, and he sat in the corner with his back against the wall and his arms folded across his chest. And every hour or so he got up and fed the stove, and every hour or so he looked out the window at the snow. And when the gray light of morning finally came up behind the ridge of spruce, he stood and put his wrap back on and said, "My boys will be up here with the tractor by noon to clear the footpath." And then he walked out into the snow and was gone. Ada sat in the warm cottage for a long time after he had left. She set the oilcloth bundle on the mantel. She added a log to the stove. She put water on to boil. She watched the snow outside the window slowly turn blue and then pink. and then gold as the sun came up over the water. And she understood in the slow way that important understandings come, that she had survived the night because a man she had met twice in her life had walked 2.5 miles through a blizzard in the dark, carrying firewood on his back, because that was what people in Ashport Harbor did when one of their own was cold. She was one of their own. She had not known that until that morning. It took 3 weeks for the county road crews to clear the coast road all the way down to Eastport, and another week beyond that for the footpath to settle enough to walk on without snowshoes. In that month, Ada did not leave the cottage except to haul water from the well and to split more of the wood Finn's boys had left stacked to the rafters in the woodshed behind the south wall. She wrote every day. She wrote for 4 and 5 hours at a time. The cold made her hands stiff, and she learned to write anyway with fingerless gloves, the pen held in a grip she had never used before, the letters on the page, uneven and strange, and hers. She wrote a long poem about Maeve. She wrote a long poem about her grandmother. She wrote a third poem, the one that would later become the title poem of the book, about a woman she did not yet know. The name of a woman who had given away something she loved in order to keep it alive. In mid-February, the mail came through. Ada walked down to the general store in her borrowed snowshoes and picked up a week's worth of letters. Bills from the electric company about the line she was trying to have run up the footpath in spring. A thin envelope from the Literary Quarterly in Portland containing a contributor's copy and a check for $60. A card from Eileen Murphy, who was in Florida for the winter with her sister, and who wrote every week. And a letter. It was addressed in a hand Ada did not recognize. A man's hand. Blue ink. An East Coast postmark. She did not open it at the store. She carried it with her up the hill, and she opened it at the kitchen table, with the stove roaring and the early afternoon sun laying a long yellow rectangle across the flagstones. The letter was 4 pages long. It was from a man named Everett Hartman. He wrote that he was 80 years old. He wrote that he lived in Teaneck, New Jersey. He wrote that he had been a teacher of American history at a public high school for 41 years, that he had retired in 2010, and that he was a widower with 2 grown daughters and 4 grandchildren. He wrote that he was writing to her because, in December of the previous year, at the urging of his older daughter, he had mailed a cheek swab to a genealogy company, and because the results of that cheek swab had arrived in January, and because what the results had told him was that the people who had raised him in a brownstone on Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn, the people whose name he carried and whose graves he visited twice a year in Queens, were not his biological parents. He wrote that he had known this already in a way. He had been told when he was 11 that he was adopted. His adoptive parents had been gentle and open about it. They had told him only that his birth mother had been a young Irish widow from Maine who had come to New York in 1946 with nowhere to raise a child, and that they had loved him from the first day they had seen him, and that they hoped he would never feel, because of the circumstances of his beginning, anything other than entirely their son. He had not felt otherwise. He had loved them with his whole heart. He had buried them with his whole heart. But now at 80, with his wife gone and his days long, he had wanted to know. The genealogy service had given him a name, Maeve Sullivan, born 1910 in Washington County, Maine, died 1988 in Queens, New York. He had written to the county. The county clerk, a woman named Maura Fitzgerald, had written him back with information about the property Maeve Sullivan had left to the town, and about the young woman who had recently taken ownership of that property under the Heritage Program, and about the ledger that young woman had found beneath the hearthstone. Mrs. Fitzgerald had given him Ada's address, with her permission, he hoped. He was writing to ask whether he might come to Ashport Harbor in the spring and see the cottage where his mother had lived. He was writing to ask whether Ada might be willing to show him the ledger. He was writing to say that he was not interested in any money, or any property, or anything that had been under the hearthstone. He had enough. He had lived a good life. What he wanted was the handwriting. He wanted to see once the handwriting of the woman who had carried him for 9 months and given him up so that he could be raised by people who could give him what she, at 36 years old and widowed in a cottage on a cliff in Maine, could not. He wanted to know what she had written. That was all. Ada read the letter twice. Then she folded it and she put it back in the envelope, and she walked outside in her coat and her boots. And she stood at the edge of the granite headland and looked at the Atlantic, which was pewter gray and moving slowly under a pewter gray sky. And she said out loud, "To no one I have found him." Or rather, she thought he had found himself. And he had written to her because she was the nearest thing to his mother still living. She wrote back that night. She told him that, yes. She told him that he should come. She told him that the ledger was his mother's, and that it belonged in the only way that mattered to him. She told him about Declan O'Brien and about the 30th Infantry, and about Aachen. She told him that his father's name was Callum Sullivan, and that his father had died saving 11 other men, and that one of those men had been Declan's father, and that Declan had been waiting in a way for him. She did not tell him about the torn page. She thought about it for a long time, and in the end she decided that if anyone was going to tell him, it should be the ledger itself in his mother's own hand. She sealed the envelope. She walked it down to the general store in the morning, and she mailed it. He wrote back in 10 days. He wrote that he would come in April. Everett Hartman arrived in Ashport Harbor on the 14th of April. On the same bus Ada had ridden the summer before. He was small. That was the first thing. She had expected, for reasons she could not explain, that Callum Sullivan's son would be a large man. But Everett was perhaps 5'7" and slight, and he walked with a cane. And when he stepped down off the bus in front of the general store, he had the careful, deliberate movements of a man whose knees had been bad for 20 years, and who had made his peace with it. His face was not Callum's face, or not exactly. His eyes, though, Ada saw from across the parking lot, were Maeve's eyes. The same direct gaze, the same refusal to look away. Ada had borrowed Finn Whelan's pickup truck to bring him up to the cottage. Finn himself was driving. He got out and took Everett's small suitcase and put it in the bed of the truck, and he shook Everett's hand and said, "Mr. Hartman, we are glad you are here." And Everett said, "Thank you, son." And the three of them drove up the coast road in silence. At the bottom of the footpath, Finn parked. Ada helped Everett down from the cab. They walked up the path together slowly, Ada on his right, Declan O'Brien coming up behind them. Because Declan had walked up from his farm that morning to meet them. Everett used the cane. He did not speak as he walked. At the top of the rise where the path came out of the spruce and the cottage appeared on the open ground, Everett stopped. He stood there for a long time. Ada did not say anything. Declan did not say anything. The wind off the Atlantic came in and moved the grass. After a while, Everett began to walk again. He walked up to the oak door. He put his hand on the door. He did not push it open. He just stood there, with his palm flat against the wood, and Ada could see his shoulders moving, and she did not look at his face. Then he pushed the door open, and he went inside. Ada had lit the fire that morning. The cottage was warm. The ledger was on the mantel, exactly where Maeve had left things for people to find. Everett walked into the room and he looked around, and he saw the firebox, and the iron crane, and the old blackened stones. And he saw the window where his mother had looked out at the ocean every morning for 27 years of her life. And he walked to the mantel and he put his hand on the ledger. He did not open it right away. He stood there with his hand on the cover for almost a full minute. Then he opened it. Ada and Declan stepped back out of the cottage. They closed the door behind them. They walked together down to the bench at the edge of the headland, and they sat there in the thin April sun, and they did not speak, and they did not look at each other, and they let Everett Hartman read his mother's handwriting alone. He was in the cottage for 2 hours. When he came out, his eyes were red. He held the ledger carefully in both hands. He walked down to the bench and he sat down beside Ada, and he looked out at the Atlantic for a long time. "She had a son," he said at last. "She had a son, and she gave him up, and she lived alone in this place for 27 years, and she never told anyone." His voice was steady. "I had wondered," he said, "whether she had loved me. I was a historian, Miss Nwosu. I knew all the reasons a woman in 1946 might give up a child. I knew that most of those reasons had nothing to do with love. I had told myself over the years that I did not need to know whether she had loved me. I had been loved. That was enough." He lifted the ledger slightly. "But she did," he said. "She did love me." She tore the page out. She tried to tear it out, and she could not quite make her hand do it. And she kept the cottage that way with the torn page in it for the rest of her life. She wrote one sentence about me in her whole life, and she tore it out, and she could not tear it all the way out. Do you understand what that means?" Ada nodded. "She loved me," Everett said, "in the way a woman loves a thing she has given away for its own sake. I know that now." He wiped his eyes. "Thank you," he said to Ada, "for keeping this, for calling me, for letting me come here." Declan, sitting on the other side of him, spoke for the first time. "Mr. Hartman," Declan said. Everett turned to him. "Your father," Declan said, "was the reason my father came home from the war. I want you to know that. My father talked about Callum Sullivan every day of his life, every single day. I would like, if you will let me, to tell you what he said." Everett looked at him. He told it the way his own father had told it to him at the kitchen table 40 years earlier. The rubble, the cellar, the men trapped inside. The way Callum Sullivan had gone in alone without orders because the officers were dead or pinned down, and because somebody had to go, and because, as Declan's father had put it, that was the kind of man Callum was. He told about the 11 men. He told the names of them because his father had made him learn the names. He told how Callum had gone back in one more time looking for a 12th man who, as it turned out, was already dead in another part of the building, and how a shell had come in on his way in. He told how Callum had been put in for a silver star, and how the paperwork had been lost, and how the citation had never been processed, and how Declan's father had tried for 30 years to fix that, and had died without fixing it. Everett listened without speaking. When Declan was finished, Everett sat for a while looking out at the ocean. Then he said, "Would you help me fix it?" Declan looked at him. Everett said, "I am a retired history teacher. I have, if nothing else, a certain amount of time on my hands. I have the DNA results that prove I am Callum Sullivan's biological son. I have my mother's ledger, which is a contemporaneous written record. I have you and your father's letters and the names of 11 men, some of whose descendants are probably still findable. We can petition the Army. We can petition the Department of Defense. Silver Star citations are sometimes awarded posthumously decades after the fact, if the case is made. I would like to make the case." Declan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, I would like that very much." Everett stayed a week. He slept on a cot in the front room of Eileen Murphy's farmhouse. Eileen had come back from Florida and had taken one look at him and decided that he was her responsibility for the duration. And she fed him shepherd's pie every night and asked him about his wife and his daughters and his 41 years of teaching 10th graders about the American Revolution. And Everett, who had lost his wife 3 years before and had not eaten a home-cooked meal with a woman of his own generation, since answered her questions and did not pretend the answers were easy. During the days he came up to the cottage, he and Ada went through the ledger together, slowly, page by page, and Ada told him what she had come to understand about the woman who had written it. And Everett told her what it was like to read at 80, the handwriting of the mother he had never met. He photographed every page. He had Ada read certain entries out loud to him, because his eyes, he said, needed the help. Declan started the paperwork. He drove to Bangor, and he drove to Augusta, and he drove to the regional office of the Veterans Administration in Togus, and he filed the forms, and he got on the telephone with the office of Maine's junior senator, and he explained in his slow, patient Washington County voice what he was asking for. He was asked to send supporting documents. He sent them. He was asked to send more. He sent those too. At the end of the week, before Everett got on the bus back to New Jersey, the senator's office called Declan and said that the request had been referred to the Army's Human Resources Command at Fort Knox, and that they would be in touch. It would take time, the aide said. These things always took time. Declan said, "I have time. Take as long as you need, but do it right." Everett left on the 21st of April. He hugged Ada at the bus station in Eastport. He was not a man given to physical gestures. Ada understood that the hug was a thing he had decided on. He held her at arm's length afterward, and he looked at her. And he said, "Miss Nwosu, when my daughters were your age, I did not understand how young 20 was. I understand now. You saved something of my mother. You saved something of me. I do not know how a man thanks another person for that, but I will spend whatever years I have left trying to find out." He got on the bus. Ada watched it pull out of the parking lot, and she watched it turn onto Route 1 and disappear around the bend, and she stood there in the thin spring wind until she could not hear the engine anymore. The Silver Star came through in October. Everett came up for it. His older daughter came with him. Declan wore his father's old suit. Ada wore a gray wool dress Eileen had given her, and the turquoise ring on her right index finger, and the blue stone ring on a gold chain around her neck. The post commander read the citation. He read the names of the 11 men Callum Sullivan had pulled from the cellar in Aachen in March of 1945. He handed the medal to Everett. Everett held it in both hands, and he did not try to speak at first. When he did, his voice was thick. He said, "I am accepting this on behalf of my father, Private First Class Callum Sullivan, who died 4 months before I was born, and on behalf of my mother, Maeve Sullivan, who carried the weight of his loss alone for the rest of her life. I never knew them. I did not know until this past spring even the shape of them. I have been given a gift in my 80th year that I did not expect and did not know how to ask for. And I want to thank in particular 2 people for it. Declan O'Brien, whose father my father saved, and who would not let the story go, and a young woman named Ada Nwosu, who came to this village a little more than a year ago, with nothing to her name, and who opened a door that had been closed for 73 years. He looked at Ada. I am told he said that Miss Nwosu has become something of a poet. I hope she will write about my mother someday. I hope the world will know what kind of woman lived in that cottage on that hill. I will not live to read most of what she writes, but I trust her to tell it." He sat down. Ada in the second row put her hand over her face and wept without sound. The story got into the Bangor Daily News that week. It got into the Boston Globe the following Tuesday. A writer for the Globe's magazine section came up to Ashport Harbor in November and spent 3 days interviewing Declan and Everett and Ada. And the piece that ran in the Sunday magazine in January had Ada's photograph on the cover. She was standing in the doorway of the cottage with the turquoise ring on her hand and the Atlantic behind her. And the headline said, "The Girl Who Opened the Door." Grey Wolf Press wrote her a letter 3 weeks after the magazine piece ran. They had seen her poems in the Portland Quarterly. They had seen the magazine piece. They wondered whether she had enough work for a collection. She did. She sent them 40 poems in February. They took 32. The book came out the following September under the title The Hearth Holds. The title poem was printed at the front of the book, set alone on a page of its own, dedicated to Maeve Sullivan and to Callum Sullivan and to a woman in Lagos named Nneka, who had once told her granddaughter that rings know things. It was reviewed in the New York Times. It was reviewed in the Sewanee Review. It was reviewed most movingly in a small Catholic magazine in Boston by a reviewer who understood in a way Ada had not known anyone would understand what the book was actually about. The book sold quietly and steadily. It was not a bestseller. It did not make her rich. It made her, she would say later, exactly as much money as she needed to live on in a stone cottage in Washington County, with a wood stove and a well and no car, which was to say enough. Her mother came in August. It was a Tuesday. Ada was in the garden which she had spent the summer clearing and replanting. She had put in tomatoes and kale and 3 rows of potatoes and a small bed of lavender against the south wall. She was on her knees in the dirt when she heard a car coming up the coast road, which was unusual because the only people who drove up that road were the mail truck and Finn Whelan and Declan, and none of them came in August on a Tuesday. The car stopped at the bottom of the footpath. A door opened. Ada heard heels on gravel. She sat back on her heels and she looked up and she watched her mother come up the footpath through the spruce in a pair of shoes entirely unsuited to the terrain. Her mother was carrying the magazine. She came out of the trees at the top of the rise. She saw the cottage. She saw Ada in the garden with dirt on her knees and on her hands, and a scarf over her hair. She stopped walking. She stood there on the footpath holding the magazine, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. She had aged. Ada had not seen her in more than a year, and her mother had aged more than a year's worth. There was gray in her hair that had not been there before. The skin around her eyes was tired in a way Ada did not remember. She was a woman Ada saw who had not been sleeping. Ada, her mother said, "Mama, I read the article. I see that." Her mother looked at the cottage. She looked at the garden. She looked at her daughter, who was no longer the girl she had packed a suitcase for. "Your father did not come," her mother said. "He wanted to. I told him not to." "All right. Can I sit down?" Ada gestured at the stone bench by the cottage door. Her mother walked over to it and she sat down carefully, and she set the magazine on her lap. They did not speak for a while. Ada washed her hands in the rain barrel. She went inside and she came back with 2 cups of tea, and she handed one to her mother and she sat down on the bench beside her, and they looked out together at the Atlantic. "I did not know," her mother said, "that you had done all of this. No, I did not know that you had been alone up here in the storms. I read about the storms. I read about the man who brought you firewood. I read about the metal. I read about your grandfather's friend's son, the stonemason. I read about the old soldier." She stopped. "I did not know," she said, "that you had become this." Ada did not answer. Her mother looked at the magazine on her lap. She touched the cover. "We were wrong," her mother said. Ada turned her face toward her. "I am not asking you to come home," her mother said. "I understand now that you are home. I did not understand that for a very long time. I was frightened, Ada. I do not know if you will believe this, but I was frightened. Your father was frightened. We did not come here from Nigeria so that you could live in a stone house on a cliff and write poetry. We came here so that you would be safe. We wanted you to have what we could not have. And we did not see until we read the article that what we wanted for you was not what you needed." Her voice was even. "Your grandmother would have understood." Her mother said, "I know that. I knew that at the time. I did not want to know it." Ada looked down at the ring on her finger. Her mother reached into her handbag. She took out an envelope. It was old. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The handwriting on the front, Ada saw with a small shock, was Neka's. "Your grandmother wrote me a letter in 1995, her mother said. "When you were 3. She wrote it after a phone call we had. We had quarreled. She thought I was being too hard on you already at 3. I was. I had made a new mother's mistakes, and I had refused to hear her. She held out the envelope. She wrote me this letter," her mother said. "And I never opened it. I saw her handwriting on the front, and I put it in a drawer, and I told myself I would read it when I was ready. She died before I opened it. I have had it for 30 years. I have never read it." Ada took the envelope. "I think her mother said it should be yours now." Ada held the envelope in her hand for a long time. Then she opened it. Nneka had written it in the careful English she had used for all of her correspondence. She had written to her daughter about how hard it was to be a mother. She had written about her own mother, who had been hard on her, and about the choices she had made in 1961 that her own mother had never forgiven her for. She had written that a mother who cannot let her child become a stranger to her will sometimes lose the child entirely. She had written that love which tries to make the child into the parent is a love that has not yet learned what love is for. She had written at the end that she hoped her daughter would one day be able to let Ada be Ada, whatever that meant and whatever it cost. Ada finished the letter. She folded it. She put it back in the envelope. She looked at her mother. Her mother was crying, silently. The tears were moving down her face, and she was not wiping them away. "I should have opened it," her mother said. Ada did not answer. "I am opening it now," her mother said. She looked at her daughter. "Is it too late?" Ada looked out at the Atlantic. She thought about what she could say. She thought about a suitcase on a front step and $300 in an envelope and a bus ride of 14 hours in a storm that had lasted 7 days, and a man who had walked 2.5 miles through the snow because nobody should be cold in Washington County alone. She thought about the hearth. "It is not too late," she said. "It is not what it would have been, but it is not too late." Her mother nodded. She did not say anything else. She sat on the bench beside her daughter, and she drank her tea, and she looked out at the ocean that her mother had crossed and that her daughter had come to live beside, and she did not try to say more than she had already said. After a while, Ada stood up. "Come inside, Mama," she said. "I will show you the hearth." Her mother looked up at her. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." That evening, after her mother had gone back down the footpath to the rental car and driven away toward Bangor, Ada sat alone in the cottage. She sat in front of the fire with her journal on her knees and the turquoise ring on her right index finger, and Maeve Sullivan's blue stone ring on the chain at her throat. And she did not write for a while. She just watched the fire. After some time, she got up. She went to the mantel. She took down the tin box that had held Maeve's jewelry, which she had emptied and cleaned and kept. She took it back to the table. She opened it, and from the pile of papers on her desk, she took a new letter she had been working on for weeks. It was addressed in her own hand to whoever finds this next. She had not finished it. She did not think she would finish it for many years. She put it in the tin box anyway, folded, waiting. She closed the box. She carried it across the room to the hearth. She knelt in front of the hearthstone. She wedged the iron bar into the gap along the edge. She lifted the stone with effort because her arms were strong now, in a way they had not been when she had first come here. She set the tin box inside the cavity. She let the hearthstone down. She sat back on her heels and she put her palm flat on the stone. "The hearth holds," she said quietly, "what the heart cannot carry." She had said it to no one. The cottage heard it anyway. Outside, the sun was setting over the Atlantic, and the light came through the 2 small windows and lay across the flagstones in long bars of gold. Ada rose. She went to the window. She looked out at the ocean her grandmother had crossed, and her mother had crossed, and she herself had crossed. She watched the light move on the water. She was 19 years old. She was home.